welcome. Happy Friday. Welcome to episode 62 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager, one of the normal hosts of the show. No Thomas Mitchoff today. We'll get Thomas back in about 10 days or so. I am joined, however, by the person who we shouted out on the show before, the person who engineered the music to this show, the founder of Purple Insider, the author of A Numbers Game, which we'll talk about a little bit later, Matthew Coller. Matthew, happy Friday. Happy summer. It's June 2nd. I'm excited for this. We did this podcast last week, about a half hour. We're going to stick to that number today. But when I said I was going to go solo today, you messaged me. You're like, look, why don't we just chop it up on this WNBA Friday? I'm really excited. So welcome, Matthew.
Thanks for having me. And I'll tell you that because I could not stand listening to the cold open, dead silence, you breathing, and then you opening the show, I was like, let's get you some music in here. Let's get you an intro. Let's get going. So I jammed it up, made a little music, and now I enjoy listening to myself every time I start the show. And by the way, I got to say, that the show with you and Thomas is an absolute must listen for me. I love what you guys have done with it. The other voices that you bring in, I'm still listening to the episode with you and Tage. So now that we got the music in there for you and you're completely rolling as a full blown podcast host. So I'm very happy and very proud of you.
Yeah, my friend Matt Stopsky said, you can even put executive producer on your title. I'm not going to go that far. I don't really want to go that far. But I have learned quite a bit. And obviously you were one. Seren Petro, who we'll have on the show a little bit later, was also very instrumental in helping me get this thing off the ground. And to your point, Thomas, adds so much to the show. He's been dealing with some things over the past few weeks, but we will get him back soon, at least once a week as we approach the season. Matt, you cover the Minnesota Vikings, a team near and dear to my heart, being from Maplewood, Minnesota. You've covered them since 2016. That was actually your podcast, which I thought was the Football Analytics Show, was the first ever podcast I ever went on, which is really cool. And, we've chopped it up ever since. You moved on to your own website, Purple Insider, in 2020 during the pandemic with rousing success. And obviously now you've gotten to a couple of books, one about the 2017 Minnesota Vikings and then one about my former company, PFF. It's been a real interesting ride, and you've gotten to see a NFL franchise at various stages of development, at various stages of success. When it comes to covering this team, the Minnesota Vikings, what's a phrase that comes to your mind when you talk about covering this team?
Oh, I don't think you can cover it in a phrase. I mean, because madness would be the first place that you would start, that there's always crazy things happening with the Minnesota Vikings, and somehow they're always in the center of whatever is going on. But I think the interesting journey for me in covering the Vikings was really seeing the Mike Zimmer and Rick Spielman era as it was peaking from the time that Mike Zimmer took over in 2014. And that was a completely rebuilding team in 2014. They draft a quarterback in Teddy Bridgewater. They draft Anthony Barr. And then the 2015 draft happens and it accelerates their timeline because they drafted multiple Pro Bowl players in that draft. And by the time I arrive in 2016, they have just come off the Blair Walsh missed field goal. And the expectations are extremely, extremely high. Not only that, but in preseason, Teddy Bridgewater has looked great. He's looked like his arm strength is improving. He's coming along. And everyone, I think, is setting the bar sky high for that Vikings team. And when you go back even and look at the NFC in 2015, I mean, there was a case to kind of talk about it almost as we do now, where who's really running away with the NFC if the Vikings are even with the Packers. And so I think they felt like it was their chance. And the moment I arrived to cover the team, Teddy Bridgewater goes down with his knee injury, which changes the entire trajectory of the team. But they were so good that they survived by talent wise, that they survived a collapse in 2016 to miss the playoffs. 2017 happens. They end up in the NFC Championship with Case Keenum. And there is kind of a moment that really shifts how everyone thought of that team and why they went after Kirk Cousins, because they had this kind of outlier, crazy season, but they set the bar at getting to the NFC Championship and beyond. So they go out, they make the huge move for Kirk Cousins. And then ever since then, every year has been the desperate flailing to make that right. And it hasn't been. Last year is kind of right-ish with 13 wins, but a negative point differential, a loss in the playoffs. But this is actually the first offseason that I can really remember. 2020 was sort of this way, but they still made a ridiculous trade for Yannick Ngakoue. And so they were still really going for it, even though they had no business going for it. But this is the first offseason where we've actually seen them take a step back approach, where they moved on from Kendricks, Thielen. Dalvin Cook is still, we're kind of waiting on that. We might get a Friday news dump as we're talking, who knows? But the expectation is still that they're going to move on from Dalvin Cook. And they've really rebuilt parts of this team, or are trying to rebuild parts of this team with a lot of draft picks and young players. Even the way they approach free agency, signing Marcus Davenport in his mid-20s, Byron Murphy Jr. in his mid-20s, guys who had down seasons last year but have shown higher end before. Both of them have some good numbers by PFF. And I think that we saw Kwesi Adofo-Mensah start to kind of take the reins here as the Vikings GM. And, he doesn't like the tag of being known as the analytics GM. And I understand why. Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess if you were known in baseball as the analytics GM, you're like every GM, but there's still an element of football where you got to be like, hey, I'm a football guy. So I get that. But I think that this year, including the draft, where we saw a lot of players with good numbers get picked by Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, that we started to see the approach that we expected when he got here. Last year was much more of a Spielman type offseason where they signed older players. They pretty much kept all of their pieces and tried to run the whole thing back. But I think we're finally seeing a sea change. And even though it isn't a drastic one from the outside world, which means you change your quarterback. So if they had traded Kirk for Trey Lance, still could happen. But if they did that, then that would have been this tectonic shift. But I think when you put a microscope on it, you see a lot of mini shifts in their approach that could kind of add up to some edges in the long term, which makes them interesting from a perspective to study from timeline and kind of where the numbers play into this.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to have some exciting stuff at Sumer Sports next week as far as content is concerned. We've kind of dipped our toes into content a little bit. It's funny. I've kind of written a series about team building, where I look at, weak link systems, and I look at restructures and void years and post June 1st and draft proverbs. And it's really funny, not because, I grew, my dad's a Vikings fan. I grew up watching the team and all this stuff. But the Vikings in a weird way have been the character in the proverb for a lot of these different team building things, right? Where you talk about, like, think back to like 1998, where they draft Randy Moss when they didn't need Randy Moss because Jake Reed had 4 1,000-yard receiving seasons in a row. That was like obviously a great thing. Take the best player available, take a generational talent. He can change the complexion of your team. Same thing happened in 2007 when Adrian Peterson was drafted 7th overall. They had Chester Taylor, who had like a 1,300-yard season before, but they took the best player available. They built around him. And, running back notwithstanding, 2007 was a little different than it is now. And Dante Culpepper in 1999, when Randall Cunningham had a great season, MVP type season. And you kind of look, and they've done a lot of great things. I actually think about what Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is doing right now. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what Brad Childress did when he started, where a lot of second contract guys who are good athletes, have good fundamentals, but aren't, I think at 06, Edgerrin James was available, but Childress signed Chester Taylor instead. Chester Taylor had a much better career thereafter. Daniel Graham was available. They took Vasante Shenko, a guy who had been a backup but had great fundamentals. And you look at what, to your point, like they're signing young players, second contract, good fundamentals. I really like that about them. And, it remains to be seen, obviously, the Kirk Cousins situation. I want to sort of talk to you about that at the very end of when we talk about the Vikings here, because I'm coming to grips with something which I'm really sad about with respect to the Kirk Cousins possible extension here. But I think about like all the things that the Vikings have done to get them to where they are. And this is Spielman, previous regime type stuff. And it almost always is this thing about chasing the previous year, right? So you can win a Super Bowl in the NFL by being defense first. We've seen it 2015 Broncos. We saw it with the 2013 Seahawks. And yet I would never try to win a Super Bowl defense first. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's always a different approach you have to win predictively versus, okay, we're in this situation and this is our best way to win. And I think that a lot of roster building, the edges are in understanding that. And the failures happen in failing to understand that. Where I always say, like, you can't win last year's Super Bowl. That's already been won. And yet when I look at Minnesota, in 98, it was chasing after Randall Cunningham, with that contract and chasing after turnovers. They had like some random dude named Jimmy Hitchcock had 3 interception touchdowns that year. And then in 2018, it was, we have a great defense. Let's just get a quarterback who can be a little bit better than Keenum. And all that slack will be made up and we'll win a Super Bowl. And the problem is that your defense is never, in the NFL currently, like they had the same 11 starters on defense in week 1 of that season as they did in the NFC title game. Like that's never going to happen. And guys atrophy, guys age out. And one of the biggest things I think Minnesota has struggled with is they just never understand that the party's over and it's time to move on. And they try to win last year's Super Bowl, and then that sets them back. And it's the reason why, like, they have these pop-up seasons every like 8 or 9 years, and they almost win the Super Bowl, and then they just can't sustain that.
Yeah, I think every year after they had a great season, like the next season, they fell off except for 87, 88. But, you go back to like 2009 and then Brett Favre comes back. And like you're saying, you're trying to sort of relive something that's already in the past where, well, we'll just bring back Brett Favre and everybody else. And then the same thing will happen again. And instead of Favre throwing an interception across his body, he's going to win the Super Bowl at that point. And I think they ended up 6-10 or something. And the 2017 to like the ripple effect from that is really interesting. And I think that this goes for kind of every team that you can look at that has some success but doesn't quite get there. And what that means, I think that I heard this saying on someone else's podcast, the basketball podcast, about how the playoffs can have more impact on what teams think of themselves and what they do in the future than even with the regular season for a lot of franchises, if not like way more. And think about maybe the Boston Celtics. You're within 1 game of going to the NBA Finals, but are you going to now make a key decision on Jaylen Brown, or are you going to fire your coach now because of the way it happened in the playoffs? And we even saw that, I think, with Kellen Moore in the NFL, where if Kellen Moore and the Cowboys don't have 2 times where they're just not good enough against San Francisco in the playoffs, he's probably still their offensive coordinator if they win one of those games. And plus it ended on such ridiculous fashion that it's just so amplified. And this is what happened to the Vikings in 2017. They felt like they got so close. Now they got crushed in the NFC Championship game. So it's not like you had a field goal just missed for Gary Anderson or something in that season. The Eagles were the much better team that year. But still, when you get to that point, that's where the bar gets set. And that's where everybody is expected to get to the following season. So they had the idea that you could run back everybody else and then you just replace Kirk Cousins with Case Keenum. And I think what they didn't maybe fully factor is that Kirk Cousins is better than Case Keenum. There is no question about it. If you put the 2 quarterbacks in the exact same situations in a bubble and play out 100 seasons, Kirk Cousins wins more games, has better statistics, everything else. But the 2017 season, quarterback season by Case Keenum, was tremendous. It's one of the best in Vikings team history. And asking Kirk Cousins to even repeat that with a different offensive coordinator, Pat Shurmur left after that year. And the approach changed. They wanted to pass first, which Mike Zimmer didn't want. And so there was internal dynamics there. And you mentioned the defense in 2018. Some guys got banged up that didn't get hurt before. They brought in Sheldon Richardson, expecting him to make a huge difference, which he did at times, but it wasn't quite the same as the chemistry that they had on the defensive line before. And then opponents matter, schedule matters. We saw this last year, the number of backup quarterbacks that they played. So in 2018, they end up missing the playoffs. Their offensive line had some injuries, and that wasn't the same as it was in 2017. And, you end up with this desperation because you never matched what happened in 2017 every year. And I think that when we from the outside analyze decisions, and I know Thomas talks about this a ton, but you can't overstate it, that expectations and expectations from ownership and those things, they really dictate a lot of what teams do. So again, in a bubble, a trade for Chris Herndon for a 4th-round pick might seem like the most absurd thing that someone could do. But if your tight end just got hurt and you know that tight end is supposed to be a position that we were really going to use this year, and we got to win, and we can't try somebody else. We got to go get somebody. There are moves that get made that make you ultimately look foolish, but in the bigger picture, you understand why it was. And it was essentially years of that. And of course, when years of that fail, then you end up with tension and you end up with clashing between the coach, the general manager. Here's the person who never wanted Kirk Cousins. Here's the person who did want Kirk Cousins, and the ownership that wanted him, and so forth. And it's an interesting story because I think that it kind of explains sometimes when your team makes a move that is not analytically sound and maybe isn't the best contract, and you just go, I don't really get it. What's my team doing? Well, there may be dynamics that go beyond that have to do with expectations and the team's timeline overall and pressure on people's jobs for why you're doing some of these things.
Well, you talk about the playoffs. It's such a good point. Because I could look at it a different way. Kansas City in 2020 was the best team in the NFL by a country mile. They lose all their offensive linemen. They lose the Super Bowl. They over-index on that. Now, it took a few other moves like Tyreek Hill trade and really drafting and being there. Patriots sort of do the same thing, right? They got close a few times. They go get Darrelle Revis. They go get Stephon Gilmore. And I think that and this is why it's important, and this is why statistics matter. Now, a lot of people want to dismiss statistics and their impact on football, but if what is fixed about your team is stable and predictive of winning, then you can go and over-index about the playoffs. Because ultimately, Patrick Mahomes is the reason the Chiefs are in the basin of teams, and Andy Reid are in the basin of 4 teams every year. Tom Brady, Bill Belichick were the reason and then so you can over-index on winning those games, right? The issue is when the reason that you're in the top 4 is not a stable thing year to year, then you over-index on the reason that you're not there. And unfortunately, and this was the issue with Derek Carr as well, and all these teams were that kind of quarterback away. Like when the Jets wanted Derek Carr and stuff like that, it's well, the reason the Jets were a compelling team last year was because their defense was great and stayed healthy and all that stuff. Do you think that that's going to happen that frequently? And so Derek Carr might not he might be enough to win last year's AFC East, but he's not good enough to win this year's AFC East when all the other assumptions are not there. And so it's really weird. And this is why, Andy Reid and Mahomes have the league by the balls, because it's they're in there because of what's fundamental to them. And so after that, it's about rearranging the chairs to win that game or two. For other teams, the reason they're there is a bunch of noise that's got a ton of degrees of freedom, and you really can't stabilize every year. And then if you think that you're one thing away, you're probably wrong. And unfortunately, that's the case for most teams. Now, when I look at Minnesota, I did, one of the reasons I would want to do the show today, and one of the reasons having you on is so great, is I did some I'm working on, for Sumer, I'm working on some of our internals, and the Minnesota Vikings, as you know, have a win total market of 8.5 games. By the way, when you think about this team has been good during the Kirk Cousins era, no, their win total has been between 8.5 and 9.5 games every freaking year. The market paints them as an average team. Even after last year's 13-win team, they're an 8.5 win team now. Over's a little bit shaded. I believe it's -130 to over. Regardless, we at Sumer make them a 7.9 win team. We give them about a 39% chance to make the playoffs, which I think is a little lower than the market. We give them a 23% chance to win their division, which is a little bit lower than the market. That's plus 300 or so. That's right around where they are. And a 1.3% chance to win the Super Bowl. we're not as high on Detroit as the market is, which is weird because I'm the restore the roar guy. The team that actually we're fairly high on, and the team, so when you look at our win totals for the NFC North, we have Detroit at 8.7 wins. We have Green Bay at 8.2 wins. We have Minnesota at 7.9, and then we have Chicago at 7.4. Chicago, by the way, that's right on their market. I think people are a little too high on them, including us. I actually think Green Bay is that team that is going to sneak up on people because you have a great coach, in my opinion. You have a defense that everybody sort of said last year was going to be really good. That did, and you're sort of a year ahead. I think about their defense like I thought about like the 2016 Vikings defense, where everybody's like, this is a caliber team to win the Super Bowl. And they just were like a little short of that. Green Bay fell quite a bit short of that. But then 17 was when everything came together. I think Green Bay, if you combine good enough quarterback play, defense where you've invested a lot, young, good talent, you have a great head coach, you have skill position players that are coming into their own, and frankly, like the relief of kind of getting a guy who didn't want to be on your team off your team. I think Green Bay is the dark horse in this division.
Yeah, so this is interesting because it ties into kind of what we were talking about with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and his approach to the offseason, because coming off a 13-win season, I think there was probably some pull to try to repeat that and try to keep everything you had. And so because they've moved out so many pieces, it actually makes it a little harder to figure out what it's going to be. For me, I think the volatility for the Vikings is a little bit more than it was last year, where when you have Patrick Peterson, Eric Kendricks, Delvin Tomlinson, Zadarius Smith, I mean, these guys have been around for a long time, and that defense was worse than we thought it was going to be. But we also knew that bringing in Shandon Sullivan, running out Cam Dantzler, like these were not things that were likely to result in them having a great defense. And it ended up being a little worse than we thought. But the point just being that, when you have a stable offense and you have a lot of veteran players who can make plays at the end of games and things like that, I think that we thought we kind of knew what they were going to be last year. And then they exceeded that because a lot of randomness, a lot of noise. And Kwesi Adofo-Mensah approached the offseason like it was a lot of noise last year, like they were a 9-win team that needed a refresh, not like a 13-win team that was trying to win the Super Bowl. But I also think that the gap is now widened between what they could be, because on defense, if Brian Flores really clicks with a lot of these young players that they've drafted in recent years, the Andrew Booth Jr., the Lewis Seen, Caleb Evans, these players are going to start. They're going to play. Brian Asamoah is going to be their starting linebacker. And they signed Marcus Davenport, who has been between 0 and 9 sacks in his career. So which Marcus Davenport are you getting is a pretty good question. So I think that there's this wide gap where if everything kind of goes wrong and these draft picks go bust and Davenport doesn't work out and Flores isn't a good fit, I mean, you could very well end up with a 7-win football team. But if everything does go right, and it doesn't even really have to be everything, it has to be Flores' system fits and young players make progress, then you can be an NFC North champion if you're the Vikings. So I don't think they can win 13 again, but could you win the division with 11? Probably that's the ceiling on this team. Yeah. So the volatility is increased. When it comes to actually all of the teams, it's like that. So it's not just the Vikings, but you can make the same point about everyone. And that's not the case for a Buffalo, for a Kansas City, for even Los Angeles Chargers, like where we know what they're going to be, assuming that their quarterbacks are healthy. But can the Lions really run back the offense that they had last year that was, I mean, downright prolific at times, that offense for them? Is their defensive improvement going to be as significant as we expect it to be because they added these veteran players? We don't really know for sure. The Green Bay Packers, yeah, you could project a lot of that lineup. And a funny thing to think about with the Packers is that would it be that hard for Jordan Love to match what Aaron Rodgers did last year? It would be impossible for him to match what Aaron Rodgers did over his career, but it would not be impossible for him to match what he did last year. And if he was the same quarterback as Rodgers was last year, which is not that high of a bar, that's maybe the 15th best quarterback in the league, then they're a couple of one-score games away in London against the Giants when they've got the ball at the goal line. They just need to score. They lose that game. I mean, there's a handful that are very, very close for the Packers. If it goes a different way, I mean, they could be a playoff team. But again, just like we're talking about the Vikings defense the range of outcomes on Jordan Love is so wide that you're talking about your projection. And I'm sitting here thinking, how can you project anything when it comes to Jordan Love? Because we've only seen a handful of snaps that he took. We saw a miserable game that he played against Kansas City a couple of years ago where he didn't look prepared. I saw a little peek at him when they were blowing out the Vikings and he got in and threw a couple of passes. And I mean, he looked fairly comfortable, but we're talking a blowout situation. And Chicago, I mean, Justin Fields' range of outcomes is massive with Justin Fields. The man has had a tanking team 2 years in a row. He finally, midseason last year, discovers that he's fast, which is weird, but just came out of nowhere. Like, I'm fast and could run past everyone. But now he's going to do that for a whole offseason and a whole year. He's got a good number one wide receiver. His offensive line is improving. His defense is improving. So range of outcomes on Justin Fields, he could be a star by the end of this year, because I don't think the first 2 years of a quarterback are that predictive, but he could also be a bust by the end of this year as well and not figure out how to throw the ball. And then he's just fast Sam Darnold or something, right? And so every single team, I think that this is one of the most difficult to predict and project divisions in the entire NFL.
Yeah, it's crazy. And to your point about the AFC, in the AFC, for you to be a contender, you need some teams that have a lot of good fundamentals to all fail, right? They need to, like, you basically, if you want to win the AFC, you need Kansas City and Buffalo and Cincinnati and, you know, a couple other teams, you know, like, but mostly those three, all teams that have the goods to all struggle, which is a tough one, right? If you are in the NFC, it's totally different. Like, you need the opposite of a bunch of teams without great fundamentals to proceed, right? Like, you know, Philadelphia, Dallas, San Francisco, Detroit, Seattle, those teams are the class of the NFC, and they're basically all a step below, and they all are fragile. If Geno Smith isn't as good as he was a season ago, if the Niners can't find an answer at quarterback, Dallas's coaching staff misses Kellen Moore, and then the Eagles have the injuries that they really didn't have until, you know, at the key positions till later in the season, then the door's open for you. In the AFC, it's much harder. And you know, again, I think that is, you know, very fundamental to, you know, projecting the season, where there's a lot of variance in the NFC. Where you don't want variance in your life, though, where you want stability, Matthew.
This is your lead-in? This is how you're leading into this? Okay.
Is in your daily grooming. And look, you talk about the Vikings season has a lot of noise. You know what doesn't have a lot of noise? Manscaped and their products. Manscaped's products, you know, they allow you to take care of yourself in peace and quiet. There's stability every single time you use it, and you know what to expect. All things that are not necessarily true all the time about the Minnesota Vikings franchise we're talking about, even though our good friend Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is trying to turn it around. But at Manscaped, everything's already been turned around. You have the Lawnmower 4.0, fourth generation lawnmower. I'm thinking about this, like, I've said this every single time. Like, you know, Thomas is a second generation Dimitrov in the NFL. Shanahan's a second generation. I mean, Belichick's only a second generation football guy. Manscaped is fourth generation lawnmower, helping serve you. If you're not down with that, but you need to clean your nose hairs or your ear hairs or all those things that can make you look old, Weed Whacker it is for you. But regardless of what you want, regardless whether that's for you or for your special person on Father's Day, 20% off with the promo code SUMER, SUMER. Support the show, manscaped.com/SUMER. Okay.
Wow.
Speaking of support.
Just wow. This, I mean, I've been on the listening end of that thing many times, and to
see it in person is probably a privilege. By the way, I'm going to see the Atlanta Dream play the Las Vegas Aces tonight. My daughter's favorite team is the Aces. Her favorite player is Kelsey Plum. I'm excited for her to get to see the Aces in person, but you know, it probably only pales in comparison to seeing a Manscaped ad read in person. I want to talk to you about your book because, look, we both have books coming out. Your book is coming out before mine. Your book is also probably for more readers than mine is. Mine's a football analytics book, a coding book, all that. You, by the way, were very gracious to read it for me. Very nice of you. And of course, your book is football is a numbers game, a look into Pro Football Focus. And and the inner goings there. Obviously, I was there when you were writing it initially. And, as somebody who's read various stages of it, it's wonderful. It's a really cool look into evolution of a game we've all loved. And you, of course, you and I are, you're one of my best friends. Like, we've interacted a ton. You sort of knew a lot about PFF, but then you go ahead and start writing this book in the summer of 2021. And I can't imagine you knew that it was going to be as compelling as it was, but I'm really excited for you. And I, just give my listeners and our listeners a little bit of an idea so they can go out and buy your book.
Yeah, it's as you mentioned, football is a numbers game, and Pro Football Focus and how a data-driven approach shook up the sport. And so, yeah, I mean, in 2021, I sort of took notice of how much the NFL had grown just from an analytics perspective. It wasn't just that teams were punting less, but also I was listening to a podcast with you and Thomas Dimitrov back when you were with PFF, and he was talking about how fundamentally, and I quoted this in the book, that the inner workings of a front office and a coaching staff have been deeply impacted by Pro Football Focus. And one of the ways that he talked about was in the rooms when you're presenting ideas and opinions and what the team should do, directions and things like that, that there's no longer this, I'm louder than you, or I have more of a gut feeling than you, or this player's reputation should be this way, that there's much more of a feeling that you have to prove it. And that doesn't just mean with numbers, but with empirical evidence, which you've done a great job and really interesting stuff in tying together scouting and data, because every scouting report is a data point in the observations that scouts make about players, which I think that sometimes you have people who want to make it scouting versus numbers, but the NFL teams that are smart are tying those two things together sort of intrinsically. And, that really caught my ear. I remember thinking about that, like, this is really a profound impact that PFF has had. It's not just, hey, my lineman ranks number 2 in something, but also think about when we were growing up, how we evaluated offensive linemen. It was like where they ranked on Madden or something. And so there's, I talked with Paul Alexander, the legendary offensive line coach, who kind of took me through his process as a coach and where PFF's data has helped him become a better coach and get his message across and study players and teach players what to look for on a game day and all these things. So there are a million kind of little micro things that PFF has impacted that add up to a lot. And then what I also discovered was a really fascinating story about Neil Hornsby, who is the guy who hired you, started PFF from his house in England because he just loved football and wanted to understand football better. So he started tracking every play, and that grew into this system that I think is a mystery to most people. So what I was able to do in this book is peel back the curtain to show exactly how the grades are made, where they came from, how Neil came up with them, and how they have been built from just a guy kind of guessing to now multiple layers of graders, cross-checkers, former players. Bruce Gradkowski, our buddy who was calling plays in the XFL this year, responsible for cross-checking all of the quarterback stuff. Zach Robinson, who is a quarterback coach for the Rams, he worked for PFF and helped them design their system. And so it's sort of funny when it's like, well, GMs say that they don't look at those numbers for the PFF grades. Like, actually, it's the NFL who shaped those numbers to what they are today. And that doesn't mean they're perfect, but there's a much deeper story than I think people understand. And that's sort of only the tip of the iceberg. But I think that the more fascinating part is just how much PFF tracking the data pulled back so much of the curtain in how we see the game and how we think about the game. And then also, made a lot of players into stars that we didn't know were stars, and got players in the Hall of Fame and impacted the way teams are thinking. And just to kind of add on to that, I mean, you see this in a lot of different areas that PFF didn't cause, but was at the center of, like the Big Data Bowl, for example. Michael Lopez, who does analytics for the NFL and runs the Big Data Bowl. You have hundreds of people making presentations to NFL teams and lots of people getting hired by NFL teams, added to front offices that are building and growing. And I think that you only can really see how far the game has come by doing what we do, which is by going back and watching a game from 2012 and you go, wow, there's so many things that they're doing that are differently out there, and their approach to when they run the ball and when they punt and all these things. And then roster building and everything else. It's every area, player value. I talked to an agent who worked with PFF early in his agent career to help him get a better contract for a special teamer and stuff like that. So I uncovered a lot of stuff that I think people would not understand about PFF when you see maybe their Twitter account send out the top 10 graded players or something, and then you quote tweet it and say PFF doesn't know what they're talking about. And it's like every NFL building is using PFF's ultimate system every single day in what they do to shape every game plan, how they watch film, all those things. So, I'm giving more than an elevator pitch for the book here, but it fascinated me at the time. And I will have to say, when I started the project to the end of it, I had no idea how much I was going to uncover. And there's a lot of that's got double, triple, quadruple meaning to it. But I really came away amazed at how much people don't know about a company that's been so influential to the NFL over the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like I certainly now I'm with Sumer and I think back in my days, like they certainly gave me a platform to become who I was. When I was just a dinky little college math professor, they gave me a platform to write and do research. And, you think about, the data is such an amazing part of what they do. And then the people that were all there, Austin Gale and Mike Renner, and, you think about Steve and Sam are still there, but, Brad Spielberg is still there. Amazing. Ben Brown, Timo Risky, those are all people who have had a part in changing a lot of football. And then, you sit back and think about the, where, now it's going, right? Like PFF has the data, they're kind of the what, and then, we were building out kind of the so what, and then Sumer Sports, kind of looks at the situation and says, no, let's get some of the best and brightest on this side doing just analysis, doing just the so what, like building off of that. And now I get to work with Tay Seth, and of course, interns I've had there are now working for the Jets and the Detroit Lions and so forth. By the way, Dan Bodine, one of our great listeners, I just pre-ordered the book. So I'm really, I'm really excited for the story of a company that was really an important part of my life, an important part of football, to get out there and now that, we're here and a different company sort of trying to build upon what they did, it's interesting. It's the great quote that you stand on the shoulders of giants to see further. That's certainly, you did a great job of documenting that there. And I can't wait for people to read that. So on Amazon, and I have this in the show description, the link to the book, Football is a Numbers Game, by Matthew Coller. Matthew, as you sort of let's end on this. So we talked about the Vikings, we talked about your book, we talked about the state of football analytics. I kind of want what, when you think about, okay, football has come from here to there. What is the next step? What is our next step in terms of understanding football in a broader sense? Because I can think of a million things, and we're working on a lot of them at Sumer, and I'm really excited about where we're going. But from, when we're thinking about, okay, how do we get the football fan more engaged? How do we get the NFL teams to sort of think a little bit differently? What is the most fertile soil there? Because I feel like we've gone a decent way, but of the ocean of possibilities, we've only drank a glass and a half.
Yeah, something Chris Collinsworth said to me when I was interviewing for this book that really stuck out was he said, I tell my guys that we never have all the answers. And if we did, we would have fixed all the NFL teams by now. And I think that is such an interesting driving force for all analytics people. And I think about baseball and how it went through its Moneyball phase. But when you think about Moneyball, they're touting the on-base percentage, right? Like, man, they need to look at those walks. And think where we are 20 years later, where you get the spin rate of a ball actually revealed which pitchers were cheating by putting extra stuff on the ball because we had the spin rate. And we get how you should be swinging a baseball bat to create the launch angle that's going to give you the most ideal line drive that will leave the park and everything else. I mean, there's all these sort of scientific things that I think are the next level of that, where we understand a lot of the basics. Hey, guys who walk are good, or pitchers who have more strikeouts are good. Like, these things were kind of known, but really we sharpened our eye to them in terms of decision making and how we analyze them and how we view them as fans. And I think we've gotten there in a lot of ways in football. But I also think that there is, because of tracking data, a whole world that we're sort of watching football in standard def still. And there's an HD to be taken back here, or to be advanced to an HD where we can really understand why certain types of players, which types of players succeed. There's even completion percentage, over expected, and rushing yards over expected, things like that I think are giving us a little bit of a view of what's going on, but we can do so much better. And I think people are going to work on it. And I think a lot of, and it's not just you, but it's also, someone like Timo for PFF, and Kevin Cole, and people like this who have really looked closely into the draft, that I think that we're understanding the draft better than we did before, but in no way are we coming close to predicting it. And Mike Renner said, someday we might be able to predict 60% of the picks accurately to whether they'll work out or not, instead of 40% or 30%. So yeah, it is the fascinating part about science in general, and science applies here, is that it's never ending. And I think the best part of that is that fans are engaged in this and actually get to bear its fruit too, or eat its fruit, because a lot of things that analytics find are more fun. This was not the case in baseball. Like, more strikeouts or whatever is not fun, and slower games and everything else that they had to make a bunch of changes. More 3-pointers is not always fun if they miss a lot of them. But in football, it's like more explosive plays and going for it on fourth down. And there's also, the more that we understand how the salary cap works, how player evaluations work, the more we can all play armchair GM. And that's been a huge, huge part of my career, is using PFF data to play armchair GM, to question Rick Spielman or to question Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, to say, look at some of these numbers and you're making a move that doesn't add up. And I think that we can grow in what we have for the accuracy of that data, even beyond just what PFF has, which is unbelievable for us to have now in compared to touchdowns and interceptions and yards per attempt. So like all the information that we have, but I think that it's made being a football fan better. To be able to see players, to give them credit, to be able to understand when your team signs an offensive lineman, did they make the right decision? I mean, and sometimes, you think it's not, and then it turns out to be, because no data is perfect, but then there's all these interesting discussions within that too. So I think that on a lot of levels, we could still be much smarter as an NFL, and that a lot of the smart teams, if not almost every team at this point, is working every day to try to find how can we be that much percentage better. Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah said something like that not too long ago, of like, we're looking at the edges and where can we be just percentage points better, because everyone is good and everyone has lots of great players in the NFL, but how can we be just a little tiny bit smarter to separate ourselves? And that's always the race that we're doing. And I feel like with the data that we have publicly that PFF has come up with, and the tracking data as well, we can all come along for that ride. Journalists can, how we write about it, how we talk about it, fans can. And that is something that, I don't know if it has existed really since Moneyball, but I think with football, because half of the joy is playing front office with the draft and everything else. You know how fun draft simulators are. I'm sure you're going to build one. So like all those things I think are tremendous elements of the football analytics revolution that have made it a better experience for all football fans, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think to your point, I think people want to simulate what it's like to, and that's why fantasy football is so impactful. And I think, for folks who are maybe want a little bit of more of like normal football flavor, like, us at Sumer Sports, we're going to have, products for that. And then also, the fantasy aspect of it too, where you literally are picking a team and seeing how it's done. But, I think about the draft, that's kind of, we're going to do that better. But to your point, the draft is like, we're already there, in terms of interest. And Now you sort of think about Over the Cap and the great work that Jason Fitzgerald and Brad Spielberger and those folks have done to sort of get people on the right path. And you see an article the other day on Vikings terror or whatever. It's like they don't understand what June 1st is, right? They don't understand why the Vikings have waited this long to make a decision on Dalvin Cook. And that's, again, no one, we're just starting to get the kind of the draft in this efficient place. Salary cap, we think about, the cap as being something that only geniuses can understand. With really just arithmetic, we get to maybe cut down day, we get to things like that, and we get to on-field play. We just scratched the surface on that with fourth downs and all those things. So what I love, and then the game is going to evolve, right? Teams playing too high, now rushing efficiency is higher than it's been in decades. And so I just love football for that aspect. And I think, PFF was, instrumental in getting kind of the first bunch of questions solved. Hopefully, as we are in this arms race now to solve the next questions, they give us even more. So this has been fun, Matt. By the way, everybody that's on the stream right now, we thank you for coming. Like, subscribe, rate, and review the show. There have been a lot of good reviews on the Apple Podcasts. Tell a friend about the show so that when we become big, you can say, I like this band first. And again, go to Matthew Coller's book. Football is a numbers game. You can get it. You can pre-order it on Amazon, wherever your books are sold. So, for guest Matthew Coller, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 62 of the Sumer Sports Show.